I originally gave the lectures on the Cosmologies of Capitalism as a set of 8 lectures to Part 2 students in social anthropology. I wrote them in 1982 and gave them for 3 or 4 years. That was 30 years ago. Amazing. And so now I'm re-recording them and have added bits and taken away bits a little, but basically they were as they were given then. But in those 30 years, I've grown older, the world has changed, and it's probably a good opportunity just to end with some reflections on the series and on later events, because now I realize that having outlined 3 great paradigm shifts, the Renaissance, leading into the progressive stage, and then the evolutionary, and then the structuralist, I witnessed in the last 30 years or so another very big shift. Whether it's a paradigm shift on the same level as the others, I don't know, which I currently call globalization, or the global paradigm. This awareness obviously has come through my own experience reading and traveling. Roughly after having finished giving these lectures in 1986, the next sort of major development was going to Japan in 1990, and the shock of Japan and its otherness, which I have written about in a book, Japan Through the Looking Glass, affected my views considerably. I mean, I knew theoretically that there was this, as it were, outpost of the European miracle in Japan, but actually experiencing it in a number of visits there and trying to understand it changed my views very considerably. I went there in 1990, but it was really from about 1996, after I'd written a book about comparing Japan and England in their medical and other history, 1996-97, I returned to the big themes that have been the subject of these lectures, by looking at a number of the people I'd lectured about, Montesquieu, de Tocqueville and others, in much more detail. So I came to write 2 books, The Riddle of the Modern World, which is about Montesquieu, Adam Smith and Tocqueville, and The Making of the Modern World, which is about Fukuzawa, Yukichi and Maitland. And this deepened my understanding of the paradigm shifts and their causes, because I looked into the lives and works of these great thinkers. The next sort of great change was really in the 21st century. We'd been to China briefly as tourists in 1996, but we went back in 2002, and since then I've been going frequently to China, become very interested in it, lectured there and so on. And this experience, alongside that of Japan and occasional visits to India, made me aware of something I'll be talking about briefly below, which is basically the rebalancing of the world, the moving back to a situation really which was present before the 19th century, whereby the East and the West were balanced in power and wealth. The other thing that happened was that I was asked to give another set of lectures, this time on developments of social theory, and so I gave lectures based on the books I've mentioned and added in Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Ernest Gellner, Maitland. So those were recorded at the time and are on the internet. And they gave me a chance to look back and to expand and deepen my understanding of these paradigm shifts. The other major event was really, it was roughly from about 2000 onwards, that having been interested for many, many years in computers and their possibility as teaching aids and for research, having set up a number of projects on video disks and computer information retrieval systems and so on. But it was really only from about the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the century, that the full power of the mixture of film and computing and the internet meant that I was aware, and many other people were aware, that we now live in a global communications world. I was early interested in such phenomenon as YouTube, Facebook, setting up my own website, recording things, and I've had a large presence in all those fields for some years, a few years now. And so what has happened basically since 1989, where I ended the last lecture, is particularly two things. One is a shift in power balance. That is the rise of what are sometimes known as the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India and China, but now many other places as well, on top of the earlier rise of Japan, meant that, and the relative decline of Europe and America, and perhaps the absolute decline in the future, means that the old idea that the West was ahead and others were to catch up is now gone. I mean, there is some catching up, but basically the whole world is now much more level and flat than it was. Secondly, that it is a globally interconnected world. It's very easy to go to places. I spent a lot of time in the East, and the internet revolution and communications revolution means that we live in an instantaneously global world. On top of that, of course, there is the political insecurities which we often associate from 9/11 and the rise of certain sects in Islam and other organizations, which mean that the easy complacency with which I ended, the end of history, can no longer be maintained. History is clearly not ended. Interestingly, the prediction I would have made from the earlier accounts was that if the balance tips back again, then the paradigm will change. And it's noticeable that from about 1990, there were foreshadowings of it earlier in the work of Marshall Hodgson on the venture of Islam and other dissidents. But roughly from 1990, what has happened is that there has been a growing body of writing challenging the whole European miracle story. In other words, a number of leading thinkers have said, hang on, we were told by Max Weber and others that there was something special about Europe, and in its either its mentality or its economic systems or something, and it would be dominant and remain dominant, and it was difficult for other places to emulate this. But look what's happened. China, India, Brazil, Soviet Union obviously earlier, Japan, and now increasingly all sorts of other countries are forging ahead, growing much faster than the West. So maybe it was all nonsense. Maybe there was no special ingredient. Maybe development is natural, universal, and it was just a lucky accident or exploitation which led one or two countries to be ahead, but there was nothing special there. So you get a number of books whose titles often indicate this reaction. For example, Gunda Frank's reorient, which was a clever sort of pun, let's move towards the Orient and let's reorient our thought. There was Blaut's colonizers' model of the world, which is a very bitter attack on Eurocentrism. There was a whole number of works by my former professor and close friend and advisor, Jack Goody, perhaps best encapsulated in The East and the West and The Theft of History, but a whole half a dozen works on this theme. And there were also works which were directed more specifically to one of the rising powers, particularly China, the work of Bin Wang, and particularly Pomerantz in his book The Great Divergence, all attacked the Eurocentric model and suggested much more a multilinear development of the world. For instance, Pomerantz argued that the world was more or less level, and China was level with the West or richer until about 1800, and then just by an accident, the double effect of the discovery of the use of coal in Britain and the wealth which Britain managed to obtain from its expanding empire around that time meant that it was just slightly ahead. So the idea in his work and in many of the others is that it's a kind of race in which one nation is slightly ahead and then another nation, and we're now rebalancing back to a world where China will be ahead of the rest for a while, and so on. Now, I won't go into my own reactions and feelings about this whole new paradigm in any detail here, but I'll just say a couple of things. One is that I have great sympathy. The arrogance and racism of the West, which I illustrated most strongly in relation to the imperial phase of the Victorian Britain, that imperial arrogance of Victorian British thought and Western thought does need to be corrected. It was nonsense at the time, and it's remained nonsense, and there is a sub-theme of arrogance in the work of many of the Eurocentric modelers in the second half of the 20th century, what is often known as neoconservative thought in America particularly, which believed that America's mission was to spread the American way of life against most resistance elsewhere. That can be taken to extremes, and it should be corrected. There are other great civilizations, and they have a great message for us. So it was, to a certain extent, a necessary rebalancing. On the other hand, the new paradigm has the feature of many paradigm shifts, which is unfortunately to bury the good with the bad, throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as the English saying is. We saw that with the reaction against evolutionism, namely that functionalism didn't solve or answer the question of origins, history, how things as they are. It just sidestepped it. It just said, let's forget that. We don't know. We'll never know. So let's get on with the work of seeing how societies function in the present. And later people realized that the problem hadn't gone away. It's just that the question had changed and ignored the problem. And I have the same feeling to a certain extent about the whole reorientation thesis. I think, for instance, that Pomerantz's work, splendid in many ways, doesn't begin to address the question of why in the 19th century Britain and the West became so much more powerful than China and much of the world. It doesn't explain why the scientific and industrial revolution occurred in one part of the world. You can't take those facts away merely by talking about coal and hidden wealth of empires in the 19th century. And you can see that in Pomerantz himself, in the fact that his book doesn't deal with science, doesn't deal with social structure, it doesn't deal with politics, it doesn't deal with family systems, it just deals with basically with economic productivity in a rich part of China compared to the whole of Europe around the time of the early 19th century. Now that's interesting, but it doesn't begin to approach Weber's problems of why this great transformation towards the industrial order we now inhabit occurred. And I think that's true of nearly all the others. What it does, what they've done, is by various rebalancings to suggest that there's really very little difference between the great civilizations over the last 1,000 years, particularly in Eurasia. And I think that's wrong. Certainly my experiences of going to China and Japan and India and Nepal suggests there has been a huge difference between them. They're not the same. Even Japan and China are very different. And by burying the differences and trying to correct the balance, we forget the question. And somehow we've got to work out a way of answering the question of the rise of the modern world by admitting that it has happened in a way which may be unpleasant, but much of what is now spreading around the world actually occurred in one part of the world and then spread, admittedly with roots from everywhere and wealth from everywhere. And we need to understand that and accept it without jumping to the conclusion that the rest of the world was somehow inferior, backward and useless. This now takes me to the last part of what I'd like to talk about, which is a growing understanding of the great paradigm shifts, the last couple of which I've lived through. When I first wrote the lectures in 1982, I was very excited at finding what I thought were big paradigm shifts in the social sciences, circular time, lineal time, and so on. I divided it very simply into four great phases: the circular time up to the Renaissance, the progressive idea of time through the 18th century, the evolutionary phase, and then the structural time from about 1890. When I came to rewrite the lectures, or at least introduce the new version of them in about 2002, I found that this was too simple and not entirely as I then thought it should be. So I revised it into a more complex version, which included more attention to things like the questions that were being asked in each period and the metaphors that were being used and so on. And I gave this in a talk and then put it up as a diagram and later incorporated it into an article. And I think it might be helpful just to complement and finish these reinterpretation of my early lectures by giving this more complex example for those who are interested. Or go to my website and www.alanmacfarlane.com and you can see the article with the divisions and diagrams in them, and they'll be reproduced in my Huxley lecture, which which I'm giving on Friday. So what I did was to divide them into, this time, into more divisions: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 divisions rather than 4. And I'll just go through them simply, showing the paradigm shifts as I now see them. First is roughly, as I put it in the diagram anyway, circular time. I've put it up to 1720, though in fact I've argued here that the Renaissance is already challenging that earlier than 1720. The people I refer to are Plato and the Greeks, even Khaldun and the medieval scholastic thinkers. So this continues with their thought. The time is seen as an eternal return, a wheel, and circular. At this time, or at this period, the West is basically on the defensive. Until the Battle of Lepanto in the middle of the 17th century, Islam is at the gates, and the power of Europe is really fairly insignificant, even compared with India. The early visitors to India were enormously impressed, and likewise China. So the West is on the defensive, and in many ways, economically and in many other ways, nowhere to be seen in the race for development and civilization. At the most, it's equality of nations. The metaphor of this period is of the natural cycle of life and growth, the seasons, the movement of the celestial bodies, everything going round and coming back, winter, spring, summer, autumn, and so on. The questions are very large questions for philosophers and others, from the Greeks onwards: the meaning of life, how to survive, the ideal state, and such big theoretical questions. The model disciplines, or the great disciplines at that time, are theology and history. The value of that whole period is that it gave, certainly to the West, many of its basic categories which came from Greek, Roman, medieval thought, and its distinctions. And it is basically the philosophical paradigm and system which is appropriate to agrarian civilizations. The next paradigm is what I came to call progressivism. That is economic and social progress, not necessarily moral progress. And this is roughly also what I called earlier the Enlightenment, Scottish and French Enlightenment, roughly a period from 1720 to 1790. People like Montesquieu, Turgot, Ferguson, Adam Smith, David Hume, John Miller, and Rousseau and others. Now time is seen as progressive time, moving along, serial time. There are outlined the stages of growth, from A to B to C, and time isn't reversible. We don't go back to the beginning. There are new things in this world, and we move forwards. This is a period when the military and productive technology of the West begins to become noticeably better. Particularly, the gap is between England and the rest of Europe, because it's just on the verge of the Industrial Revolution, the beginnings of the Agrarian Revolution, and it's the beginnings of early imperialism. The British Empire is beginning to spread rapidly in the 18th century, and others are following. So there's a sense, a tipping of the balance is beginning, but it's not very noticeable yet. The metaphors during this period are encapsulated in enlightenment, from darkness, the darkness of the past, the ignorance, the medieval period, to the light of the present, from the rough to the smooth, from the simple to the complex. Those are the ways in which people think. The questions now are, what are the stages of growth? And how can we improve our life here on Earth, which is behind, for example, the work of many of the Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Alan Smith in The Wealth of Nations. The model on which our understanding is now based, the scientific revolution has got underway, and so it is Newtonian science, mathematics and other sciences, and to a certain extent the craft disciplines, the making of things, which become the models, mechanical types of models. The universe ticks along. God is the great clockmaker. So what was the value of this paradigm? Well, it gave us the basic types and stages of civilizations for many of the social sciences, which derived from Scottish and French philosophy of that time. And it also was broadly comparative. Montesquieu wrote the first great overview of world civilizations in the spirit of the laws, and Adam Smith continued this, as did others. In our order to understand our own civilization, we needed to look at China, India, all around the world, and to understand how different civilizations had grown and prospered. This was finally based on the period of scientific and technological growth and the great thrust outwards of exploration, the discovery of Australia and the mapping of the Pacific, and the growing knowledge of the inner areas of Eurasia. So that was the next paradigm. As I explained in the lectures, there was then a pessimistic withdrawal, a period which I roughly put at 1790 to 1840, when the dream was, to a certain extent, shattered. This is encapsulated in the later Romantic movement, where people, in the earlier Romantic movement, people like Blake and later others, begin to see the loss of nature and man's close relations with nature. There's a sadness here, and in the theoretical field, Malthus, in his theory of the early theories of the laws of population, which would mean we could never escape from our predicament, the later or Tocqueville's work, which both rejoices in the new world of America and England and also laments the loss. So there is a period of pessimism, and here time becomes much less progressive. There's some progress, but there's some decline from progress. There are dangers, there are traps, there is the horrors of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And the power of one part of the world is dampened by by Napoleon, the French wars, and the horrors of the industrial and urban revolutions. And the imperialistic thrust outwards is not quite as firm as before. Some of the money-making methods, like slavery, the costs of this become apparent, and the anti-slavery movement means the withdrawal from the Caribbean to a certain extent. So it's a period of muted imperialistic expansion. The metaphors now are again that of natural cycles, of birth to death, of historical cycles. So it's more circular than it had been. And the questions people are asking themselves is how to avoid the dangers ahead, the economic, demographic and political dangers which the French Revolution had highlighted and the consequences of industrialism were making apparent. The model disciplines now are again theology, Paley's work and so on, and to a certain extent biology and geology. And the value of this period is that it balances the over-optimistic views of Godwin and the utopians in the 18th century with a more realistic appraisal of the difficulties faced in moving from agrarian worlds into industrial ones, the basic dangers and traps, and the fact that utopian political visions, such as that of Rousseau, don't necessarily work. So this is the beginning, certainly in Britain, of urbanism and industrialism and the period of the French Revolution and its aftermath. This lasts roughly till the 1840s, and the next stage is what I then came to call the evolutionary stage. This is roughly 50 years, 1840 to 1940. This is the period Darwin, Marx and Engels, Herbert Spencer, Morgan, Tyler, and others I've talked about in earlier lectures. And this is a period when time becomes, again, much longer term, evolutionary and growing. Time stretches out now not over a few thousand years, but over millions of years with the discoveries in geology and natural history. And it is a time when, or a period when the balance, as I've said, becomes very tilted. The West is almost entirely dominant in every way, in its firepower, in its industrial power, in its voracious appetite and expansion. It's the period of mature imperialistic domination. The metaphors now are basically organic, taken from biology, from seed to plant, from acorn to oak tree, of metaphors and ideas of division, of growing complexity, diversification, many of them fitting both the social as devised by Marx and Spencer and others, and the biological by Darwin, Wallace and others. The question now are the origins of human civilizations, the placing of civilizations on ladders, steps up to where we are, the dynamics of evolution, and what is going to be the future. Model disciplines are biology, archaeology, geology, and the value of this is that it reinforces the comparative approach. Many of these great thinkers like Sir Henry Maine, Marx and others were very interested in the history and systems all around the world, and like the 18th century they wanted to map the whole world, and they devised general laws of evolution and again made firmer the underlying patterns on which most of the social sciences were based. Sociology, anthropology, psychology, history, and so on, derived many of their grand theories and even their methodologies from this period. It's the period of imperial dominance of the West and mature industrialism. So that goes on roughly to 1890, and then you get the reaction, which I talked about briefly, of diffusionism, the realization that actually ideas and technologies don't go in unilinear sequences. And roughly from 1890 to 1920, people like W.H. Rivers in his late work, Elliot Smith to a certain extent, Fraser, Haddon and others have a diffusionist blend to their work, and you find it in archaeology and other disciplines as well. Time is now conceived of as rippling out from centres and cores out through different cultures, but it's less a unilinear development, more centres of development. It's a period when suddenly the power balance shifts again, and the West can no longer be so confident and dominant. The rest are catching up with the West, particularly Japan in the far East, Russia after the revolution, and in technologies and wealth. So it's a period of modified imperialism. The imperial growth is less dramatic, and much of it, the confidence is shattered by the First World War. The metaphors are of the spread of ideas and species. The questions are, where have things originated? How do ideas and techniques spread? And the models are taken from biology and technology. The values of this is that it's much less Eurocentric, because many of the ideas came from Egypt. It's more relativistic, and it connects peoples with each other and looks at the large-scale culture history of, for example, Melanesia and the work of rivers. So there's a long-term perspective, an acceptance of the importance of origins in history, and it's a suitable sort of philosophy for a world in which the growth of power is occurring, the growth of Indian nationalism and the debacle of the First World War. The next paradigm is a sub-part of what I called structuralism, namely functionalism. This is roughly from about the First World War with Malinowski and the Trobriand Islands, but particularly from 1920 to about 1950. And this is Malinowski, Radcliffe, Brown, and many of the earlier anthropologists, but it spreads across all the disciplines: functional engineering, aesthetics, sociology, psychology. So it is a paradigm shift in many ways within a larger shift. Time here is largely static, short-term change. Equilibrium is the hallmark of this approach. It's cross-sectional, it's a detailed study of a cross-section in time. And it is the kind of holding philosophy, as I've argued before, for a period when European empires and European power and American power was much more balanced. It's the time of the independence movements growing in India and elsewhere, of two world wars and the chaos in the West, of colonialism rather than outward imperialism. The metaphors now are taken from the Industrial Revolution, which is spread everywhere. In other words, complex machines with moving parts, functioning parts of a whole structure. So it's again a mechanistic model, as had been present earlier, but in a different way. So you need to see how the parts fit together. The world is a mechanical system which we need to understand. So the questions are, what are the functions of a part? If you want to look at something, look at what it does. So what does marriage do for a society? What do myths do for a society? What does the family do? And so on. So the question is, look at an institution or a strange belief or whatever it is, and then answer it in terms of its function. This had a great virtue because it meant that almost everything, since it has a function, is not as stupid as you thought. So totemism or primitive exchanges or witchcraft or whatever it was no longer just dismissed as superstition and stupidity, because clearly it had a useful function. In other words, if it was useless, it wouldn't continue. So you ask the questions, what is the whole composed of? And you then compared the functions. And again, this meant that you could see that we believe in this, they believe in that, they both have a function, and they're both, to a certain extent, equally valid ways of facing the problems that humans face. And the models for this period are taken from technology, from machines and so on, and also from biology and the functioning of systems within biology. The great value of this period, and it was a very valuable period in many ways, was to redress the ethnocentric, temporocentric bias of the West, and also to look at things in detail. The way to get further was to concentrate on a particular place, on a particular time, and to understand it in all its context and all its detail. And so it leads to relativism and an attack on arrogance. And this was, in many ways, a great advance for anthropology and other disciplines. The next paradigm shift, which is really of interest most to anthropologists, and I won't go into it in detail, is what was known as structural functionalism. This is really for my students, roughly from 1935 to 1980. And this was the work of my teachers, really, the people who influenced me. Maya Fortiers, Evans Pritchard, Raymond Firth, John Beattie, Max Gluckman, a little earlier, Radcliffe Brown. And I was taught by the great structural functionalists. They saw time, again, circular within itself, like Fortiers' circles, and so on, but they weren't really interested in long-term schemes very much, or the origins of systems, but more with their functioning. But they concentrated much more on social structures. They didn't take institutions like economic exchange out of its context or whatever. They looked at a whole social structure and then saw how it functioned. They did believe to a certain extent in self-correcting equilibria, but there was some interest in history, and it was much more nuanced than the earlier functionalism of Malinowski and others. This was the period exactly of the end of the British Empire, the end of colonialism, and into a move into a post-colonial Cold War age. The metaphors here were now still of machines and structures of various kinds, and the questions were, how do social structures work? What is the pattern within given societies? The models were taken from technologies, to a certain extent. In anthropology they were borrowed from law and sociology, and this period continued the enormously valuable intensive studies of particular societies around the world, which give us in many cases the only record we have of disappearing tribal and other worlds, and a deeper understanding of ourselves and of societies. This is the period of late colonialism and post-colonialism. I then drew attention to one of the main evolutionary resurgences after the war, namely Marxism, neo-Marxism, which was very influential when I was teaching in the Department of Anthropology in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. These are people like Maurice Godelier, Maurice Bloch, Peter Worsley, Eric Wolf, Jonathan Friedman in anthropology, and their equivalents in sociology and other disciplines, no doubt. They were interested in long-term evolution of systems over time, the concerns of the evolutionists, and in the stages through which societies move, though they rejected a good deal of Marx's rather oversimplified schemes of but there was still a lot of discussion of the stages through which we pass. This is the time of the battle of ideologies, the Cold War, of development and underdevelopment, of what to do about societies where the standard of living was still appalling, which was the best approach. So power was now, there was a conflict between powers, but it was the time of the rising ascendancy of America and in many ways a period, as I've said elsewhere, of growing confidence through the growing power of technologies. The metaphors used were again from biology to a certain extent, the biological growth of animals and plants which go through different stages. And the questions were again very large. What is the basic determinant in history? And political. How are we mystified by ideology? How can we escape and build a better world? The models were taken from sociology, history, and economics. And there was a value in all of this, in that it returned us to large questions and longer time spans, and demystification of ideologies. Alongside it, and I didn't deal with this in this diagram, but I've talked about it a little bit, was a parallel but opposite evolutionary development in technological evolution, Marvin Harris, Lynn White and others, and in economic development, Rostow, stages of economic growth, and in the idea of some kind of European miracle, which I've talked about elsewhere. Also alongside it, at the same time, because all these different models were contesting with each other, was a paradigm which became very powerful in my own discipline, which was structuralism. That was not social structure in the English sense, but structuralism in the French sense. And this was to be found in the work of anthropologists like, most famously, Levi-Strauss, Edmund Leach, Mary Douglas to a certain extent, Godelier, not Godelier, Dumont, Louis Dumont, and so on. Time here was more or less static, layers of time, cross-sections, and it was based on the idea of a growing equality. Levi-Strauss showed the richness and complexity of the mythical systems and social organizations of different societies around the world. And human beings thought basically in a similar way, the psychic unity of mankind, and a recognition of the striving of all humans for equality and dignity. The metaphors used were of geological strata, of linguistics, of surface and deep structures, and the way the brain worked. And computers were beginning to develop rapidly in this period, and the idea was to a certain extent that civilizations and societies had deep structures of computer programs, and behind it was the structural idea that meaning lies not in particular things but in the relation between things. This comes originally from mathematics through philosophy. So it's a relational approach which was important also in computing at this time. And so the questions were things like the relations of relations, how you had relations between groups and then relations between the ways they represented themselves in myths and totemism and so on. Binary, split, that is binary mathematics or binary computing or binary myths, was an important word at this time. And it was a search for deeper universals of human thought and the human mind, the codes which lie behind the surface of our existence. The models were taken from linguistics, cybernetics, and computer science, from branches of linguistics such as semiotics, study of signs, and from geology. And the value was that it was an encompassing approach which looked at everything as interesting, from myths to food habits to the way we arranged our furniture to everything was interesting, and great attention to thought, symbolism, and so on, and made us realize the affinities between different levels of our life and behavior. And it might be characterized as the digital age. Finally, at that time, I looked at what I call the post-age. That's after about 1985, and that's because it was often known as post-colonial or post-modern or post-this or post-that. But I think probably I prefer now the global age, because that recognizes the particular effect of global communications and so on. The people I outlined in the diagram then were Edward Said, in anthropology, the late Geertz, Jack Goody, Bruno Latour, Marcus and Fisher, and so on, all sorts of people to whom I've added from history, those who've challenged the Western ethnocentric view. So this is a new paradigm. Often there's less interest in time, though not always, but there's a great interest in politics and political time. In terms of power, it's a global world. Communications have made it very interdependent. The American hegemony, which I emphasized in the diagram, has actually been challenged by the rising power of Asia and South America. The metaphor, according to my diagram, certainly for postmodernism and so on, was texts and metatexts, discourse analysis, linguistics, and so on, though I think that's not entirely true now. The questions were, how does our context shape our inquiries? How do we represent each other? Who is the author? Etc., etc. So some navel-gazing and some anxiety and some attack on ethnocentrism. The models are taken from literary analysis, from media studies, from aesthetics and communications theory. And the value is that it makes us suspicious of hidden meta-narratives. It makes us more questioning, more reflexive about our own world. It reduces some of the arrogance of the West, and it tries to encompass the whole world into a single story and redress various balances. And here we are in the global age, and who knows the future. Thank you for persisting, if you have, until this point.